An elderly man decided to test which of his sons was the most filial, so he faked his death and lay in a coffin. He decided that whoever cried the hardest would inherit his wealth. However, the two sons had already seen through his plan and decided to make the death real. They pretended to mourn while secretly nailing the coffin shut. When the last bit of light was swallowed by darkness, the elderly man realized something was wrong. But by then, the funeral procession had already begun. No matter how much he cried out, no one would listen. The two sons, well prepared, pretended to be heartbroken and cried loudly. They claimed their father enjoyed a lively atmosphere and asked the band to play louder. Thus, the only sounds that filled the air were cries and music, and his desperate pleas went unheard. The night before, while the elderly man had discussed faking his death with the hunter, his two sons overheard the conversation. They immediately came up with a plan. If both the hunter and their father died, they could inherit the wealth. So, even when they heard their father's cries, they ignored them. Soon, the elderly man stopped breathing, and the funeral procession reached the burial site, a mine. Surprisingly, as the two sons entered the mine, they saw a pile of gold placed in the center. This was the reward the elderly man had prepared. Upon seeing the gold, the two brothers, who had once been harmonious, became excited. But as they fought over the treasure, the cave suddenly collapsed, sending them to join their father. This was the elderly man's fate, a direct consequence of his actions. 20 years ago, he had treated his own father in the same way. Back then, he was his father's favorite youngest son. To ensure the wealth went to him, his father had driven the eldest son out of the house. However, the youngest son's long-term pampering had made him greedy. In his desire to gain the wealth sooner, he began to plot his father's death. One night, while his father was asleep, he carefully laid wet tissues on his father's face. This way, no noise would be made, and his father would suffocate to death. At first, everything went smoothly, and no one suspected anything during the funeral. But just as they were about to send his father off, the old man suddenly sat up. He had not died completely. Seeing his father point at him with trembling hands, the youngest son panicked and ordered his men to deal with the situation. Under the temptation of money, his men immediately grabbed a rock and struck the old man. The blood splattered onto the white calligraphy of filial piety, making the scene ironically tragic. In the end, the father died at the hands of his beloved youngest son. However, during the funeral, they encountered the eldest son, who had become a bandit.